They lied to you about life, they lied about death, and most of all, they hid what happens after your heart stops beating. What is revealed at that moment is not the end. It is the beginning of a reality that few have the courage to admit. Consciousness does not disappear. It crosses invisible boundaries that, to this day, mainstream science pretends not to see. Throughout this video, we will touch upon silenced truths, fragments of forgotten knowledge, revelations that connect spirituality, neuroscience, and the limits of modern physics. What happens to the mind when the body fails? What mysteries hide in dimensions where time and space dissolve like mist? There is evidence, there are signs, but almost no one talks about them. Get ready. In what follows, you will understand why these answers were hidden, and how discovering this truth can change not only your view of death, but your entire existence. What happens at the exact moment of death? The moment of death is wrapped in more mystery than we dare to admit. For centuries, it was believed that death was simply the end, an abrupt shutdown, an inevitable collapse of the body. But Werner Schiebler, while investigating near-death experiences and consciousness phenomena, proposed something that challenges everything we have been taught. At the very moment the body fails, something awakens. A new perception, invisible to the eyes, but as real as the air we breathe, seems to emerge. Could it be that what we call death is actually an opening to another form of existence? Mainstream science usually measures death by the cessation of heartbeat and the absence of brain activity. But what about the testimonies of patients who, clinically dead, accurately describe events happening around their bodies? Who was observing if the brain was no longer emitting signals? Schiebler suggested that consciousness not only survives death, but is freed from biological constraints at that moment. Like a flame leaving a broken lamp, could it be that our essence merely changes state? Medical reports collect stories that defy any rational explanation. People describe encounters, life reviews, sensations of absolute freedom, all while their bodies lay motionless on operating tables. Modern neuroscience still struggles to understand how these phenomena are possible. And what if what happens isn't hallucination, but perception of a layer of reality our physical eyes were never programmed to see? What kind of vision is this that only reveals itself when we leave matter behind? Werner Schiebler believed that, at the moment of death, our consciousness reconnects to a different vibrational frequency, something similar to tuning an old radio to another station. The solid, limited physical reality collapses like a stage being dismantled after a play. But the actor, the soul, continues its performance in a setting our senses cannot yet decode. If we die to one reality, in what unknown theater do we begin to live again? And here arises a question few dare to ask. If consciousness continues, if there is an other side as vivid as this one, what exactly awaits us there? A distorted copy of Earth? A void of silence and light? Or could it be that our thoughts and emotions shape this new environment, like invisible brushes painting reality? The absence of definitive answers does not lessen the unease. It only makes it more urgent. But the most disturbing hypothesis of all is an even bolder one by Schiebler, rarely discussed outside specialized circles. What if, at the exact moment of death, we not only changed planes, but also recovered truths our earthly mind could never bear to remember? What are these truths hidden in the shadows of our own consciousness? For a long time, it was believed that consciousness was merely a byproduct of the brain, like smoke rising from fire. But as reports of out-of-body experiences, visions during clinical death, and inexplicable memories surface, that view begins to crumble. Werner Schiebler was one of the first spiritual scientists to affirm, the mind is not confined to the gray matter inside our skull. It may, in fact, be the true source of existence. What if we are merely using the body as a disposable glove? In neuroscience laboratories, near-death experiences continue to defy known logic. Patients without vital signs, without detectable brain activity, report visions, clear thoughts, and precise perceptions of their environment. How can eyes see without corneas, ears hear without eardrums? Schiebler saw in these phenomena proof that consciousness is an independent field, a spark capable of existing beyond organic limits. Does our deepest identity survive intact after the fall of the body? Ancient philosophies, such as the Vedas and Hermeticism, already spoke of a traveling soul, an immortal principle that merely wears flesh temporarily. Today, scientists like Pim van Lommel and Sam Parnia seriously investigate what was once dismissed as superstition. Could consciousness be the true substance of the universe rather than a mere chemical accident? What would this reveal about who we really are and what still awaits us beyond this world? Werner Schiebler believed that as consciousness detaches from the body, it enters a state of expansion never attainable during life. Sensations of time and space would dissolve, as if we were waking from a dream within a dream. But what would we find in that freedom? The echo of our deepest fears, or a luminous vastness where love and wisdom become as tangible as the ground beneath our feet? In his work, Schiebler also proposed a disturbing hypothesis. What if the physical brain, instead of producing consciousness, was merely a translator, a rudimentary radio picking up fragments of a much greater mind? This would explain why, when the body fails, experience continues. The transmitter breaks, but the broadcasting station remains alive. If this is true, where is this station located? In another dimension? Within ourselves? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: if consciousness survives, is there something or someone waiting for us on the other side, ready to reveal what has always been hidden? What prevents us from remembering now what we are only capable of seeing after death? When we look in the mirror, we see only the densest and most visible part of who we are. Flesh, blood, bones, a fragile shell that inevitably deteriorates over time. But what if there were an invisible structure as real as our organs, sustaining every heartbeat? Werner Schiebler asserted that beyond the physical body, we carry a subtle organism, the spiritual body, that survives the decomposition of matter. If this body exists, why can't we see it with our ordinary eyes? In ancient times, wise Egyptians, Hindus, and Greeks already spoke of a second skin made of energy and consciousness. They believed that physical death is not the death of the eye's person, but merely the abandonment of the heavier garment. And today, surprisingly, experiments with electromagnetic fields and Kirlian photography suggest that forms of energy not yet fully understood surround living beings. Could this detected aura be the same spiritual body described millennia ago? Werner Schiebler viewed the spiritual body as an essential intermediary between the immortal soul and physical matter, a bridge sensitive and moldable that records emotions, thoughts, and traumas throughout life. Spiritual psychologists like Carl Jung and Stanislav Grof also suggested that our psyche carries imprints far beyond what the brain is capable of storing. If our deepest scars do not disappear with death, how might they shape the next chapter of our existence? Mediumistic reports analyzed by Schiebler describe the spiritual body as surprisingly similar to the earthly body, but endowed with its own plasticity and luminosity. It would react directly to our thoughts, assuming denser or subtler forms depending on our state of consciousness. If this is true, could it be that we are already shaping our appearance in the afterlife, with every emotion we silently nurture? Even more intriguing, Schiebler suggested that traumas, addictions, and limiting beliefs are imprinted on this invisible body, determining future experiences after death. Just as stains on clothing do not disappear simply because we change environments, Our emotional imbalances would accompany us beyond physical life. How many marks, invisible to the eyes but deep in the soul, are we carrying without even knowing? What if the key to preparing our spiritual body lay precisely in simple, invisible daily attitudes, like lighter thoughts, purer intentions, and detachment from earthly fears? But what exactly happens to this body when we finally cross the boundary of death? What if the other side of life wasn't in some distant heaven or a hidden corner of the universe, but right here, only on another frequency of reality? Werner Schiebler proposed that the separation between the living and the dead is not spatial, but vibrational. Just as radio waves coexist in the same space without mixing, entire worlds could exist layered over ours. If the distance separating us from the departed is merely a difference in vibration, how many of them might be around us right now, invisible to our senses? Quantum physics has already shown us that particles can exist in superposed states, present in multiple places at once. Reality is not fixed, it is malleable, pulsating, full of subtle layers we are still far from understanding. Schiebler saw in this the scientific explanation for the spiritual world, a universe vibrating on another frequency, inaccessible to ordinary perception. What if the dead never really left? What if they simply changed the channel while we remain stuck on a single station? Various reports from mediums and sensitives describe the spiritual world as extremely similar to ours, but more fluid, more shaped by emotions and intentions. Houses, trees, entire cities, everything would appear more alive on that other plane. If physical reality is merely a denser vibrational shell, what happens when our senses finally tune in to perceive what has always been hidden behind the veil? Schiebler suggested that physical death is nothing more than a change of frequency, like the delicate tuning of an antenna searching for a new signal. And according to him, there are people, rare but real, capable of briefly tuning into this other dimension even during life. Moments of déjà vu, premonitions, vivid dreams would be small glimpses of a reality that usually escapes our reach. Have you ever felt, without realizing it, the proximity of this other side? And then comes the question that echoes like a restless whisper. If vibrational worlds coexist side by side, why is our perception so limited? Who or what defined the sensory boundaries that prevent us from seeing beyond? Are we prisoners of a frequency so dense that we no longer remember what it was like to see the full scope of reality? What if, in fact, death is just the first tuning adjustment, and what we call reality is merely the first among many hidden worlds, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves? Since childhood, we have learned that memory is a fragile record, trapped in the labyrinths of the brain. But what if this idea is profoundly wrong? Werner Schiebler, investigating reports of regression and post-death experiences, suggested something unsettling. Our memories do not belong to the brain, they belong to the soul. They are not products of matter, but eternal records that cross the barrier of death. If everything we live through remains recorded beyond the body, who would we be if we carried our pains and loves with us forever? In deep hypnosis, some individuals access memories that are not limited to this life. They speak of other names, other eras, other deaths. Psychologists like Brian Weiss and Ian Stevenson documented these cases with impressive rigor. How can we explain a child describing in detail a village they have never visited? What if our personal stories are much larger than our current identity suggests? If time is merely an illusion, how many lives intertwine silently within us? Schiebler saw the subconscious mind as a kind of sacred archive, a field of memories that remains untouched even when the physical body dissolves. At the moment of death, this vast archive is not lost. On the contrary, it becomes even more vivid. The experiences we try to forget, the emotions we repress, everything reappears, like pages turned by an invisible force. If the past does not disappear but accumulates, how would that shape our next existence? Some spiritual traditions teach that upon death, we review our entire life in a single instant, not merely as spectators, but feeling the emotions we caused in others. What if the justice of the universe does not come from divine courts, but from the living memory of everything we have been? The idea that the true self carries the echo of every choice, every thought, every action is both frightening and liberating. How many versions of ourselves are lying dormant, waiting to be rediscovered? Werner Schiebler said that death does not instantly transform us into enlightened beings. We carry with us our virtues, but also our conflicts, our sorrows, our attachments. In essence, we are what we cultivate now. Death does not erase who we are, it merely removes the masks we wear. If we are always carrying ourselves through time, what are we sowing in our souls at this very moment? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: if all our memories survive intact, do our mistakes accompany us as well, waiting to be corrected in another life or in another, even more mysterious reality? In countless near-death experience reports, a recurring image emerges, an intense, welcoming light that seems to possess its own consciousness. In some cases, luminous beings, described as old friends or spiritual guides, appear to those on the brink of death. Werner Schiebler believed these visions are not the deliriums of a dying brain, but windows into a much vaster reality. What if death is not a plunge into the void, but a carefully orchestrated encounter? Traditional neuroscience still struggles to explain why, during brain failure, some people report experiences that are so organized, so coherent. Random hallucinations would not follow such clear patterns, nor would they bring so many sensations of love and comfort. Schiebler saw these lights as manifestations of spiritual intelligences, consciousnesses vibrating at a frequency that only becomes perceptible when we shed physical limitations. Could these beings have been waiting for us since before our birth? In ancient spiritual traditions, like the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a similar phenomenon is described: beings of light guiding the soul through its first steps after death. It is no coincidence. From indigenous cultures to Western esoteric texts, the same narrative repeats. What if these visions are, in fact, recollections of a process known to our soul, but forgotten by our earthly mind? What if we are meeting familiar faces erased from our conscious memory? Werner Schiebler also proposed an intriguing hypothesis. Perhaps it is not the light that comes to us, but we who begin to see a presence that was always there, hidden by the limits of our physical senses. Love, protection, wisdom, forces that seemed invisible now become tangible. If death opens the vision of the soul, what else are we missing while trapped in the density of the material world? There are also reports that speak of life reviews, conducted in the presence of these beings, reviews without judgment, but imbued with immeasurable compassion, as if they help us understand our choices, not to punish us, but to teach us. If this assistance exists, who are these guides? Old acquaintances from other lives? Higher fragments of ourselves? Or consciousnesses so ancient that we can barely conceive of them? But Schiebler also left one question hanging in the air. What if not all light is benevolent? What if there are beings, disguised in brilliance, that lead the soul into traps of illusion? How can we distinguish who truly comes to guide us, and who merely seeks to imprison us in another way? At night, while the body rests and the senses sleep, our consciousness seems to gain freedom. In lucid dreams, where we know we are dreaming and can consciously interact with the environment, scenes, encounters, and sensations arise that defy everyday logic. Werner Schiebler believed that in these states, the soul partially detaches from the physical body, accessing spiritual realities. What if our most vivid dreams are not mere creations of the mind, but true journeys to hidden worlds? Modern science acknowledges the phenomenon of lucid dreaming, but still cannot fully explain how the dreamer seems to manipulate settings, converse with autonomous beings, and receive unknown information. According to Schiebler, during deep sleep, the bonds of the physical body loosen, allowing consciousness to cross invisible boundaries. Could we, while sleeping, briefly cross into the same dimension where those who have already departed now live? Ancient records, like those of the Egyptian peoples and Tibetan traditions, describe practices aimed at navigating the dream world, communicating with spirits, and receiving guidance. Coincidence? Or clues that this ability was already known and cultivated thousands of years ago? When we dream of deceased loved ones and feel emotions as vivid as in waking life, are we merely simulating or truly reuniting with them on planes where time and distance do not exist? Werner Schiebler believed that some lucid dreams are more than personal adventures. They are messages, invitations, warnings, or celebrations coming from the other side. But how can we distinguish an ordinary dream from a true spiritual communication? Perhaps through the details, the intensity of the emotions, the unmistakable feeling that something greater was at stake. How many messages have we already received in our sleep and ignored upon waking? Even more disturbing is what some mediums report. In certain states of lucid dreaming, it is possible to visit regions of the beyond destined for newly deceased or still confused spirits. In these visits, we are sometimes helpers, sometimes learners, sometimes mere witnesses to realities that waking life would never allow us to see. If, during sleep, we cross secret portals, what are we leaving behind? When we wake up and forget? But Schiebler issued a troubling warning. What if the key to these encounters during dreams depends on our emotional and moral state while awake? What would happen if we carried into the dream world the invisible chains we cultivate here on Earth? In the world of subatomic particles, where classical logic breaks down, a disturbing truth emerges. Nothing is lost. Not energy, not information. Modern physics confirms that everything transforms, reorganizes, but never disappears. Werner Schiebler saw in this natural law a powerful clue about the human soul. What if our consciousness were a form of energy, subtle, complex, yet indestructible, that merely changes state when passing through death? Scientific experiments show that even when a particle dies, its information pattern remains recorded in the fabric of the universe. Could the same be true for our essence? If the energy of our thoughts, feelings, and memories does not vanish, where does it reside after the body dies? Schiebler proposed that the human soul is a particle of eternal consciousness, navigating between worlds according to its inner vibration. Are we, unknowingly, part of a cosmic mathematics that never stops calculating our existence? Esoteric traditions have always spoken of the soul's immortality. But now, quantum physics is beginning to suggest that the very structure of the universe may be made of conscious information, an infinite interweaving of minds and realities. If we are inseparable parts of this great universal consciousness, what does it mean to die? Perhaps it is merely the change of a vector, a new direction. For our endless journey, what paths await us in this hidden geometry of existence? Werner Schiebler liked to use a simple but powerful metaphor. Life would be like a drop of water returning to the ocean after traveling through countless rivers. Death would not extinguish the drop. It would simply return it to a much greater sea. If this is true, then the anguish of death is an illusion for those who have forgotten the vastness from which they came. If we are drops of the infinite, what ancestral memories do we carry in the depths of our consciousness? This idea provokes a silent unease. What if, instead of disappearing, we were being called to integrate into larger patterns, archetypes, of light and wisdom that shape new worlds? Death, then, would be less an end and more an initiation, an invitation to expand our identity to limits we cannot yet imagine. But what forces determine the next destination of our essence? Do we choose consciously, or are we drawn by the gravity of our own thoughts and desires? Schiebler, however, left a question hanging in the air, perhaps the most unsettling of all. What if eternity is not merely a promise of continuity, but also an unyielding mirror of everything we are? What part of us survives intact, and what part dissolves like smoke into the great sea of consciousness? Most of us believe, even if unconsciously, that life is the main stage, the definitive play where everything happens. But Werner Schiebler held a disconcerting view. This existence is merely a brief passage, a kind of school for the soul. The physical world would be a great theater of trials and learning, where suffering, joy, and challenges shape our consciousness. If everything we face here is just a rehearsal, what is the real performance we have yet to see? Plato already spoke of the sensible world as an illusion, shadows projected in a cave, far from the light of true reality. Similarly, Schiebler saw Earth as a laboratory of experiences, where every circumstance, every encounter, every loss is carefully planned to awaken something in us. What if the greatest pains we carry are actually secret invitations for our evolution? How many signs have we ignored, thinking they were just cruel coincidences? Spiritist philosophy reinforces this idea by stating that physical life is a brief stage among many incarnations. Here, we experience the density of matter, the limitations of time, the barriers of language, so that, upon returning to the spiritual world, we bring with us something only concrete experience could offer, the wisdom earned through our own effort. If we are in an invisible school, what have we truly learned? Are we ready for the final tests to come? Werner Schiebler believed that the great challenge of earthly life is not to accumulate wealth or pursue pleasure, but to awaken dormant consciousness. Each obstacle would be like a mirror, forcing us to see aspects of ourselves we would rather ignore. Sometimes the greatest teachers come disguised as adversaries, and the greatest blessings are hidden behind painful losses. If everything is part of a larger plan, how many lessons are we still resisting to learn? Many believe that death is liberation, the glorious end of all suffering. But Schiebler warned, death by itself transforms no one. It merely returns us to the spiritual reality with everything we have gained, or failed to gain, here. If we haven't learned the lessons life tried to teach us, we will be called to new cycles of experience, perhaps more intense, more challenging. Are we listening to what life is trying to tell us? And a question arises that, once asked, never leaves us in peace. If every difficult situation is a veiled lesson, what will happen if we continue to ignore the subtle messages of fate? What will be the next test reserved for a soul that refuses to awaken? For centuries, communication with the spiritual world was treated as something mystical, reserved for mediums and sensitives. But Werner Schiebler brought forth an even more intriguing perspective. What if modern technology could be used as a bridge to those other realities? In quiet research, voices have been captured on recorders, images have appeared on static televisions, and inexplicable sounds have echoed on empty radios. If machines can pick up signals from the invisible, what kind of reality are we inadvertently tuning into? The so-called instrumental transcommunication, ITC, defies conventional logic. In documented experiments, electronic devices seem to record sounds and images that have no identifiable origin in this world. Schiebler saw in this the confirmation that the spiritual plane operates on specific frequencies, accessible, even if imperfectly, with our instruments. What if every radio, every camera, were a potential window to other dimensions, waiting only for a tuning adjustment? Even more disturbing is that in many of these communications, voices claim to be from deceased loved ones, spiritual guides, and even consciousnesses that have never had a physical existence on Earth. Some messages bring warnings, others, advice. Some simply echo feelings of longing. If the barrier between worlds can be crossed by the vibration of a device, what does that say about the real fragility of the veil that separates us? Schiebler believed that the human mind, when focused and intentional, acts as a living antenna, enhancing these contacts. In other words, it's not just the technology, but the consciousness associated with it that determines the quality of the communication. If our thoughts shape the bridge, what kinds of realities are we inadvertently calling with our fears, desires, and hopes? Are we connecting only with benevolent spirits? Or also attracting presences that dwell in zones of shadow? The possibility of speaking with other dimensions in an almost physical, tangible way completely changes the understanding of death and life. Perhaps death is not a farewell, but merely a vibrational distancing that at certain moments can be overcome. What if future technology allows clear and constant dialogue with those who have passed on? Would we be prepared for the truths they might bring? But Schiebler warned of a risk that few consider. What if, by opening these doors, we are also inviting forces we do not yet understand? Who really would answer our call from the other side? What if death were not the end of a story, but merely the closing of a chapter? Werner Schiebler firmly defended the reality of reincarnation, the idea that the soul, after leaving the physical body, prepares for a new cycle of experiences in another time, another place, another body. Not as punishment or reward, but as part of a continuous process of refinement. If we return countless times, how many faces have we inhabited without remembering? Researchers like Ian Stevenson documented thousands of cases of children who recall astonishing details of past lives, information that, in many cases, has been historically verified. How do we explain a child speaking languages they never learned, describing families they never met? Schiebler saw in these accounts the confirmation that the soul carries deep impressions, crossing the veil of death with invisible marks from the past. What emotional inheritances do we carry without knowing? Eastern philosophies, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, have treated reincarnation as an unquestionable fact, long before modern science even dreamed of investigating it. Each life would be a unique opportunity to correct old mistakes, to live new lessons, to expand consciousness. But if each existence is only one step, how many rungs still remain on the long ladder of spiritual evolution? How many times are we reborn to learn the same lesson we stubbornly refuse to face? Werner Schiebler suggested that the soul, upon reincarnating, chooses, or is helped to choose, the ideal circumstances for its growth: family, body, place of birth. Nothing would be random. If that's the case, then every encounter, every challenge, every pain has a purpose that transcends immediate understanding. Are we all living carefully interwoven stories written by ourselves on higher planes? What silent agreements did we seal before crossing the threshold of birth? And what if there is no such thing as luck or coincidence, but only the echo of choices made long before our first words? The person who irritates us today might have been our ally in another life. The fear that paralyzes us now may be the shadow of a mistake made centuries ago. If we are ancient travelers in temporary bodies, how do we change the script we seem doomed to repeat in circles? The answer, perhaps, lies not in what happens to us, but in how we respond to each experience. But Schiebler posed yet another unsettling question, one that resonates with anyone bold enough to think beyond the obvious. What if the real prison isn't the body, nor the earth, but the emotional patterns that keep us stuck in endless cycles? What kind of rebirth might we be preparing right now, without even realizing it? Here, in the density of matter, our thoughts already silently shape our days. So imagine what happens when we're freed from the weight of the physical body. Werner Schiebler stated that in the spiritual world, thought is the most powerful creative force. Every emotion, every mental image, every deep desire would materialize almost instantly, shaping the environment around the soul. If we are capable of building our reality here, what invisible worlds are we already constructing for after death? Mediumistic reports from various cultures describe spiritual regions that are surprisingly diverse. Gardens of light, cities of wisdom, but also gray and shadowy zones where pain and confusion still reign. These descriptions vary so much because, according to Schiebler, each soul finds in the afterlife what it carries within. What we plant in our daily thoughts will blossom as entire landscapes in another dimension. If the mind is the paintbrush of reality, what have we been drawing without noticing? Modern physics already admits that the observer influences the behavior of matter. At the quantum level, intention alters the outcome. If that is true here, where density slows manifestation, imagine what happens in subtler planes, where thought is the primordial clay. Schiebler saw the spiritual plane as the inevitable extension of each being's inner world. We are not just visitors of the beyond, we are also its architects. But how many of us live aware of this silent responsibility? There are reports of spirits who, after death, remain trapped in landscapes of fear, guilt, or remorse, not by divine punishment, but because their minds, still immersed in old patterns, recreate those realities. At the same time, souls that cultivated love, gratitude, and compassion awaken in luminous, vibrant living environments. If heaven and hell are, in part, projections of our inner state, are we building right now the dwelling where we'll awaken after death? Werner Schiebler said that thought is not just a passive force, but a silent invitation that attracts compatible realities. Just as destructive emotions shape zones of suffering, elevated thoughts build bridges to worlds of light and wisdom. If everything we feel and think remains as a seed vibrating within us, what harvest awaits us beyond this brief life? But perhaps the most unsettling question is even more subtle. What if, even now, we are coexisting with those realities our own thoughts have created without realizing it? What invisible worlds already surround us, waiting for the moment our inner eyes finally open? Upon crossing the threshold of death, many souls do not go alone. Reports of near-death experiences and mediumistic communications speak of welcoming presences, beings that appear in the shadows of the unknown to guide the newly deceased. Werner Schiebler believed these entities are more than projections of our desire for comfort. They would be consciousnesses specialized in assisting those who leave physical life. Who are these invisible architects, silent builders of bridges between worlds? In spiritual traditions, they are described as mentors, angels, guides, or beings of light. According to Schiebler, their mission is not only to welcome, but also to clarify, comfort, and prepare the soul for what comes next. Some are older spirits with great evolutionary experience. Others are friends and family who return solely for this loving task. If there are consciousnesses dedicated to helping us in the crossing, what do we really know about the organization of the other side? There are impressive reports of people who, in near-death states, recount dialogues with these presences. Questions are asked, decisions are considered, forgotten memories resurface. The passage, then, is not merely physical, it is also a deep dive into the true self. And what if these encounters are, in fact, a kind of spiritual triage, where each soul is guided according to its clarity and needs? What trials do we face in the crossing without even realizing? Werner Schiebler saw these invisible architects as engineers of consciousness, designing reception areas, adaptation zones, learning centers. They do not force, judge, or impose. They simply offer the tools necessary for each spirit to awaken at their own pace. If such a carefully assembled support network exists, why is the fear of death still so deep within us? What blocks our natural trust in this invisible support? But not all encounters are immediate or easy. Spirits deeply attached to matter, immersed in guilt or fear, often take time to perceive these presences. For them, the architects must wait, respecting each soul's free will and internal timing. If the other side is so patient with us, why are we so impatient with our own growth processes here on Earth? And Schiebler left one more question hanging in the air, one few dare to seek an answer to. What if, in rare cases, the architect awaiting us is not a stranger, but a forgotten part of ourselves, dormant in higher planes, waiting only for the final reunion? Who truly comes to meet us when we cross the invisible boundary? Much is said about the light seen at the end of the tunnel at the moment of death. A welcoming, irresistible light that seems to contain all the love we've ever felt. But Werner Schiebler warned, crossing the tunnel is only the beginning. That light is not the final destination, but the gateway to a vastness still unknown. If what lies beyond the tunnel is more complex than our religions describe, what awaits us after this first threshold? Near-death experiences often report the crossing of the tunnel followed by encounters, life reviews, and then a decision to continue or return. But what happens to those who go further? Schiebler suggested that beyond the light lie multiple regions, states of consciousness as diverse as humanity itself. Spiritual cities, learning zones, spheres of evolution. Could we be merely in the antechamber of a reality infinitely greater than we suppose? Mediumistic accounts speak of territories where thought shapes matter, where light has density, where emotions build and transform the environment in real time. The journey beyond the tunnel is not merely geographic, it is an inner passage, a dive into the deepest levels of the self. Those who are not emotionally prepared for this new perception may become lost, confused, or even recreate illusions similar to those of material life. If consciousness is the key to navigating this new world, what kind of compass are we building now? Werner Schiebler described the spiritual plane as stratified, vibrationally segmented according to each soul's inner state. Thus, not everyone who crosses the tunnel arrives at the same place. Some awaken in environments of indescribable beauty, others in gray and oppressive regions, still trapped by their own shadows. If the destination after death is shaped not by external judgment, but by the intimate truth we carry, what invisible realities are already being gestated within us? But there is an even greater mystery. Certain traditions speak of spheres so elevated that the initial light becomes only a pale reflection of what lies ahead. Levels of consciousness where the individual self begins to dissolve into a cosmic perception where words lose meaning and only the pure vibration of being remains. If there is something beyond the light itself, something our earthly mind cannot even conceive, what are we truly destined to rediscover at the end of this long journey? And Schiebler left one final provocation hanging in the air. What if the true crossing only begins when we overcome even our attachment to the light? What invisible worlds await those who dare to go beyond what most would never even dream of imagining? Since time immemorial, accounts of life after death, invisible, worlds and the continuity of consciousness have been recorded. They appear in religions, esoteric traditions, personal experiences, and even in the boldest research of modern science. And yet, these truths continue to be treated as taboo, as fantasy, as something to be hidden. Werner Schiebler saw this, not as a coincidence, but as a silent project. If the immortality of the soul is real, why are we taught to fear the unknown so deeply? The fear of death has always been a powerful tool of control. Entire peoples have been ruled by promises of salvation and threats of eternal damnation. If we understood that death is merely a natural transition, we would lose our fear, and with it, much of the control that dogmatic religions, political systems, and social structures have exercised over the centuries. Schiebler believed there is a hidden interest in keeping humanity in ignorance, separated from its true immortal nature. If we are free by essence, who benefits from our inner imprisonment? Even in science, where critical thinking should reign, there is resistance to seriously investigating phenomena related to post-death consciousness. Researchers who dare to enter this territory are ridiculed, marginalized, ignored. How many discoveries have been suppressed, silenced, or distorted to preserve the myth that we are only matter? And what if our true identity is far grander, far freer than we've been led to believe? Werner Schiebler saw the pursuit of spiritual knowledge as a silent rebellion against this conspiracy of fear. To know our eternal nature is to reclaim power over our own existence. Every book we read, every spiritual experience we live, every intuition we follow takes us a little further from the fog of ignorance. And yet, the question remains, why is it so difficult to find clear information, free from dogma, about what really happens after death? Perhaps because the greatest secret is not simply that life continues, but that it expands, transforms, becomes even more real than everything we know here. And if that truth were to come to light, how many power structures would collapse? How many fear-based systems would lose their strength in an instant? Perhaps the liberation of the soul is much closer than we think, waiting only for us to have the courage to question everything we've been taught. And Schiebler still left one final question hanging in the air, like a seed planted deep within: the consciousness. What if the real secret isn't just about life after death, but about who we truly are, and what we are capable of creating the moment we awaken from the deep sleep of illusion?